A very good afternoon, respected teachers, distinguished guests, and student companions. On this special occasion of In Conversation with Leaders, the annual lecture at BK Majumdar Institute of Business Administration, I, Anuj Mehta from third year, extend a very warm welcome to all of you. Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, he once said, "When learning is purposeful, creativity blossoms. When creativity blossoms, thinking emanates. When thinking emanates, knowledge is fully lit. And when knowledge is fully lit, economy flourishes." And we at BKMIBA have learned when economy flourishes, people progress and the nation grows inclusively. As a student of this institute, I can vouch for it that the lectures delivered by the leaders in the annual lecture series at BKMIBA have encouraged an environment of learning and nurtured excellence. On this note, I invite our director, ma'am, Professor H.D. Trivedi, to formally welcome all and tell us a little more about the occasion. Ma'am.
Thank you, Anuj. Shri Kiran Karnik, thank you for agreeing to deliver the fourth BKMIBA annual lecture. Dr. Pankaj Chandra, Chairman Board of Management, Ahmedabad University. Praful Bhai, former Chairman Board of Management, Ahmedabad University. Dr. Devnath Tirupati, Dean MSOM. Shri B.M. Shah, Registrar, Ahmedabad University. Heads of programs, invited guests, donors, and well-wishers of the Institute, colleagues, and student friends. A very warm welcome to all of you at BKMIBA, the BBA and the IMBA programs at Amrut Modi School of Management of Ahmedabad University. I would like to begin by giving a brief introduction of Shri Kiran Karnik to this young audience. I am very happy that we have with us today as our chief guest a polymath, a man of diverse accomplishments ranging from science and technology to IT education, who is here to share with us some insights that could illuminate your future path. And by the time he finishes speaking, you will realize the meaning of the words that I have just spoken. We are indeed fortunate to have you with us, sir, today. A postgraduate from Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, Shri Karnik holds an honors degree in physics from Bombay University and has been widely recognized as a thought leader and guiding force for the Indian IT industry and for promoting Brand India. Shri Karnik was the managing director and CEO of Discovery Networks in India, where he spearheaded the launch of Discovery Channel in South Asia in August 95 and Animal Planet in 1999. From 91 to 95, he was the founder director of the Consortium for Educational Communication. Earlier, Shri Karnik also worked for over 20 years at the Indian Space Research Organization, where he held various positions, including that of founder director of ISRO's Development and Educational Communicational Unit. His work in ISRO involved conceptualizing and managing applications of space technology. He has done consulting assignments for Ford Foundation, WHO, the World Bank, UN Institute for Disarmament Research, and an extended one for UNESCO. He is presently a member of the Scientific Advisory Council to Prime Minister, the Honorary Chairman of the National Foundation of India, Chairman of Vigyan Prasar and President of India Habitat Center. Forbes magazine voted him as Face of the Year 2003, and Business Week named Sri Karnik as one of the stars of Asia in 2004. Sri Karnik has been conferred various awards and accolades, and I would refrain from reading out the long list, but mention only a significant one, namely the Padma Shri in 2007. He regularly contributes to various publications and has authored and edited a large number of such publications. He continues to share his knowledge through lectures at major national institutes from time to time. And most importantly, for all of us, it's a good fortune that we have him as the member of the Board of Management of Ahmedabad University to guide us and steer us in our days ahead. I would request our student representatives to present Sri Karnik with flowers and a memento as a token of our welcome and appreciation for being with us today. I would take this opportunity to introduce Professor Pankaj Chandra, Chairman, Board of Management of Ahmedabad University, to our student friends. Everybody knows you, sir, here in this hall, but probably they do not know of some of your accomplishments. And I would again refrain from listing all of them, but just mention a few. For the benefit of those of you who are not aware, I would like to mention that he is an extremely well-respected academic. He has taught around the world, from McGill University in Canada to Cornell University and Wharton School in the US, to University of Geneva in Europe, to University of Japan and Renmin University in Beijing. And he has been at the top of, at the helm of the top business schools, namely IIM Bangalore, before he joined us as Chairman, Board of Management and Provost, Ahmedabad University. Thank you, sir, for agreeing to be with us and share your opening remarks to set the tone for this annual lecture. May I request Dhruvi, our General Secretary, to please welcome you. Before I go any further, and I won't take long, I, on behalf of all of us, would like to welcome our other esteemed guests. And I request again Dhruvi to do the honors. Praful Bhai, thank you for coming. You have been the inspiration for these annual lectures. Your raising of your eyebrows as a question to why this, the answer is you have been the inspiration for launching of these annual lecture series. Dr. Tirupati, Dean, Amrut Modi School of Management, Shri B.M. Shah, Registrar, Ahmedabad University, Shri Mavlankar, our esteemed donor. His father, Shri Narhari Mavlankar, and their family has awarded this institution with an award for social service. When we were in conversation with them and they wanted to do something, and we said, we've got, the community and society has really given us corpuses for various awards, but this is one area where we don't have. And they were quick to take it up. And every year they remind us that it's time for the annual day, it's time for that award money, the check to come across. Thank you very much for being with us. Professor Parag Patel, Principal, HL Institute of Commerce, and our very own Jainil, the Secretary of HL Alumni Association, of which we are also a part. Normally on this occasion, I would like to talk about a few highlights of our institute and the achievements of our students. But having come from the BOM meeting this morning, I know that Sri Kiran Karnik knows all about us. And I wouldn't like to, he has a very small window of time in which he has graciously agreed to share with us. So I wouldn't like to eat into that time of his, but I would just like to mention one significant highlight that one of our students have recently achieved before I close, and that is our third-year student, Neville Hirpara, has been selected by the Keio University of Japan to spend an entire semester there, which is fully paid. And this is a selection which takes place across India. He is the only student on a national level to get selected. And the icing on the cake is that he is the second such student in quick succession to be selected from this institute. Last year also, the BKMI BA student Aishani was selected, and she gained a great deal by spending a whole semester there. And I think Ahmedabad University has taken her up. So I thought I would just leave this piece of information with our audience and with you, sirs. And it would be remiss on my part if I did not thank Sri Karnik for sparing his valuable time, Professor Pankaj Chandra, all our invited guests, heads of programs for being with us today. And I'm sure we all look forward to hearing from the two esteemed speakers on the dais. Professor Pankaj Chandra, please.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Trivedi, Karnik Saab, Praful Bhai, Upen Bhai, Mavlankar Saab, Devnath, colleagues and friends. With some people, it's very difficult to get a yes. For some people, it's very easy to approach to get a yes. And Karnik Saab happens to be in this latter category. When we reached out to him, there was hardly any hesitation in accepting this fact that he was he would like to come by and talk to you, and there's perhaps a very interesting reason which is hidden in what Professor Trivedi, the way you introduced Karnik Saab. Today's environment is one where people who sit at the pinnacle and contribute with immense impact are probably those who've lived many, many lives. And many lives in very disparate kind of settings. Actually, your life and the examples of where you worked and what you've done is so fascinating, because it probably stands out as an example to many that there's learning that happens across experiences and places that you work. And life makes us traverse all kinds of directions to create impact. In fact, yesterday there was when I turned the TV on, there was an interview of Warren Buffett on CNN, and he's those of you who know, I think need no introduction, but otherwise, he's the sage, as he's called, the sage of Omaha, who says that he's a chairman of Berkshire Hathaway and also one of the all-time investors who's done very well. So he talked about Bill Gates and about success. And interestingly, the comment that Bill Gates made to him was that what somebody does between age 13 and 18, if you kind of observe your passion between that age and you pursue that passion, then you're sure to be successful. So maybe we're going to kind of ask you that question, what were you thinking between that age? But it seems Bill Gates said his passion was coding. So the anchor asked Warren Buffett, so what were you doing between 13 and 18? And he says, actually, I was investing. So many of you are probably still in that age group to discover your passion and find out. The point I think that was being made is that people who are very dedicated, committed, and focused constantly try to pursue things that excite them. And that may come from a variety of different engagements, may come from a variety of different experiences, may come from a variety of different jobs. But all of them will have some thread which connects them. And I think it's very important to think about life in that manner, because the world that you are going to inhabit in times to come is fraught with immense and very exciting changes. Very new things are happening, new things will happen. And those who can find their passion and pursue it, sometimes to your satisfaction, sometimes to less of your satisfaction, but so long as you continue, I think you'll be very happy and success will follow. I'm not going to stand between you and Karnik Saab, because I know he has a very interesting theme and a talk for you. But I wish all of you best. I'm quite sure students from BK, like others at the university, are really going to rise to the top wherever you go. So best wishes. Thank you.
Professor Pankaj Chandra, Mrs. Trivedi, Professor Bhai, leaders, faculty of Ahmedabad University, young friends, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I want to say what an immense pleasure it is to be here today. First, because I've had a long association with Ahmedabad University, thanks mainly to Professor Bhai, and I've enjoyed it immensely. And to me, the second reason is a very selfish one. While both Pankaj and Professor Trivedi said kind words about my willingness to come here, I'm very selfish. I have more to get out of this than you have probably, on one condition. I enjoy interacting with young people because of the questions and comments I get. It gives me a perspective of what you're thinking, what your concerns are, what worries you, what solutions you have, what problems you have. But that works only if you're active. So I want this session to be an interactive one. I'm going to speak as briefly as I can, but I want to lay out a certain sort of framework within which we might talk, but you're free to ask at the end of it any questions whatsoever, and I'm one of those foolish people who will answer any question. I'm not politically correct, I won't comment on this, I'll say anything, so feel free on that count. I also want to say that I'm a bit overawed, not to see so many young faces. I've got used to that. Remember, I spent 7 years in the IT industry, where my age was at least 2 times the average age of anybody I talked to, because the IT industry is all guys in their 20s. And whenever I went to talk to people who were either in the gaming business or in ethical hacking, or sometimes not so ethical hacking, they were below 20. So if I have a problem with my cell phone, the first thing I do is look for somebody who's below 20 and say, hey, help me. So that's where you folks are. But I'm overawed because of the galaxy of people in front of me. I love speaking to students because they have all kinds of questions, but they just assume very wrongly that I might know more than them. But here I have my teacher, Praful Bhai, who taught me in the old days when I was IIM. And then I have luminaries like Pankaj and a whole host of your faculty here. So I'm a bit careful about how I might put this across. Thank you very much, Professor Trivedi, for that detailed but very generous introduction. Some of it is past tense, but that's okay. It's all absolutely correct, but some of it is over now. Let me start and tell you the theme of my talk. Unfortunately, I have not got audio visuals, or fortunately, some of you may think of it either way. One reason, among many others, is that at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, if you use a PPT and turn the lights down, half the audience goes to sleep. So the audio visual is me. I'm the visual, I'm the audio. So bear with that. And I will try, as I said, to try and time myself so we have a lot of time for interaction before I have to leave and before you people get too bored. But let's get on with it. So the theme of my talk really, and I picked a title which is partly common, partly something which I was working on, partly something which has already been used. The title is Humans Need Not Apply. Humans need not apply. And you can, as you can imagine, this is a job ad. Think of it as one of those large ads you see sometimes in newspapers or on the websites, and you're scouting around. Sorry, not you young people, you've got some years to go yet, but other people are looking for jobs. But more than that, look at yourself 3 years, 5 years from now when you're ready to go into the job market, having done a BBA, an MBA, maybe something more. And then you look at, so what are the opportunities? Of course, a lot of people will come to campus for placement, but you want to see more than that. So you look around, and suddenly you see this big thing that says humans did not apply. Now, what does it mean? And I want to start from there and tell you the context of today and the changing world as you look ahead when you enter the job stream and way, way before you're as old as I am. This really stems from two factors. One is, and Pankaj mentioned this in his talk, the changing world. We're going through changes always, but the speed of change, the rapidity of change has greatly accelerated. And one thing it is doing is it's changing the whole complexion of way things happen. And I'll come back to elaborate on that a little more. The other one is obviously, which is partly driving this change, is technology. And technology is making possible all kinds of new things. And again, a little more on that in due course. But just look at some of the things which have changed. And from the theme that I spoke of about jobs and humans, when I look back, not too long ago, not the days when I was very young, but just, maybe 10, 20 years back, jobs like something which many of you may not have even heard of, and I now address myself to younger students here, a job called a stenographer. So when you were the big boss sitting in your corner office, and you wanted to send out a letter to somebody, you would call your stenographer and dictate the letter, which means you spoke, and the person took it down in shorthand. And that's a dying thing already. Shorthand is an abbreviated version of English language, and then go back and type it out on a typewriter, something called a typewriter, which is a manual one. Again, some of you may see that in museums. So, now today, as you probably know, the job of stenographer doesn't exist. There are no stenographers any longer. You do your own work on a computer, you type it yourself, or more and more, for people like me who are okay but use one finger yet for typing, you have things like all kinds of, speech-to-text systems. An Indian one is DragonSpeak and lots of other ones which are there. So you just speak and it types on, and you just correct it if you need to. So the job of stenographer is gone. Other one, which is even more recent probably in India, is telephone operator. Today you don't need telephone operators. In the old days you were an exchange, you were a telephone operator. In the older days, 25 years back, if you were calling a small town in India, there was no what was then called subscriber dialing. So you didn't dial 011 for Delhi, if any of you use it on your phones now, because most of you, I'm sure, have your friends' names and you just press one button. But if you're actually dialing, then you dial 011 and the landline number, if you're dialing a landline, which also are getting extinct. In the old days, for a small town, you called up the telephone exchange and booked a trunk call. And the telephone operator would take down the number, and whenever the line was free, make the two-way connection. That job's gone. So you're thinking I'm talking of old times. Come to more recent times and very contemporary stuff. Look at a job like a driver. go around, you have an auto rickshaw driver, you have a taxi driver, and all of you have already read, I'm absolutely sure, of the Google driver of this car. It will take some time before you and I can go out and buy one, but it's there, it's coming, it's around the corner somewhere, 5 years, maybe 10 years at the outside. So what will happen? 10 years, 15 years from now, no jobs for drivers. But that seems 15 years away. Even today, there's something far more sophisticated than a car, which is an aircraft. And today you have things called drones or unmanned aerial vehicles, the bigger version, not the small version we'll talk of in a moment, which fly around. Now, some of them deliver unhappy things like bombs, but they're well-guided ones that fly without a pilot, remotely controlled from somewhere, sometimes completely autonomous. You feed in where they need to go, they come back and land. So what's going to happen? If you read about airline accidents, you will see that a fair percentage of them are attributed, rightly or wrongly, to pilot error, because the human being there, the pilot, makes some mistake, or as in one extreme case, drops off to sleep, or in a worst case, decides to commit suicide and take 250 passengers along with him. So, you put an end to all that when you don't have a pilot. And that's coming. So those of you who after doing a BBA suddenly say, hey, I want to give it up, and you just heard Pankaj, my passion is to fly planes. Watch out, you can fly planes for leisure, but not as a job, because there will be no pilots. By the time you finish and do your pilots training, nobody may want pilots. All the aircraft will be remotely piloted. So I won't go on and on, when we chat, I'd like some of you to come up with your own examples of what jobs may die 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now. But the lesson is that this change, which is being brought about by technology and by a whole host of other factors, which again I won't dwell on, is creating a complete change in what professions exist and what don't. Again, well, just one more example, because Pankaj mentioned it, and he said Bill Gates' passion when he was between 13 and 18 was coding, which is a fact. But in the world of today, not tomorrow, already coding is dead. It's all automated. Coding is automated now. So if you want a job in that industry, you have to go to a higher level. You have to do something more sophisticated than just mere coding. So those of you who, after your BBA want to do code writing, forget about it. That job won't exist. You have to do something much more complex, much more sophisticated. So the lesson across the board is that jobs are going. And I picked these examples by choice because at one end you have something which is, high skill, but fairly simple. At 12th standard, typically a stenographer, which I first started with, could be a 10th or 12th standard person who learnt stenography by going to a class for 3 months and picked up good typing skills too. A telephone operator, probably even less than that, very simple thing, nothing sophisticated required. On the other hand, a pilot, lots of work. If you want to become a commercial airline pilot, it takes anywhere between 1 and 2 years. And even that job, with that degree of training and sophistication, is going, as is code writing. So it's not the sophistication of the job in some sense. It is not how much you train for it. It's not all about just being educated so that you get a job. It's about the change in the workplace and the change that technology is bringing about. So keep that in mind, and we'll come back to what it might mean for you, that 5 to 10 years from now, the kind of jobs that you imagine yourself in being, just think twice, will they exist or no? And they may or may not exist, you don't know. Think of that. The second factor, which I mentioned in passing at the beginning, is the change. And one of the factors of change is that we don't know what the change is. So we don't know what kind of jobs will go away. Some are predictable. I mentioned the driverless car or the pilotless plane. But some we don't know. There may be suddenly something which in the popular jargon today is called disruptive technology. Something that comes up suddenly which you didn't imagine, which will suddenly throw a lot of jobs or a lot of professions just out overnight. As you know, artificial intelligence is being already spoken of, done, a lot of work going on that. So the earlier assumption that jobs that would go with those will be those that can be automated, so those which are simple, or those for which in simple words you might say are rule based. So do this, do this, do this, do this. So you can instruct a computer, a robo, somebody to do that. But with artificial intelligence, the attempt is to make them think like humans. So you anticipate situations, you look at the unknown, and then go and do it. So you don't know what will change. That's one factor to keep in mind as you look ahead and see where they are. So what does this mean? And I want to touch on another theme now, which I want to spend a few minutes on, maybe more than a few minutes, is innovation. Now, why do I speak of innovation, and how do I relate it to this? Because as of now, it will change. but it won't change, I expect, in another few decades. So, by the time you get into a job and begin working, hopefully you stay there, that is that machines find it difficult to innovate, to think of something completely different. They can be trained to do systematic steps, they can be trained a little bit to think like humans, but not quite that leap that humans are able to take, to innovate, to do something completely different. I said this is speculative because I'm sure some of you can argue with good logic that even machines may learn to do that. But I think that may be a little more difficult. So let's spend a few minutes on innovation, that if that is one answer, not only for the job thing, but let me spend, half a minute before I get to the other theme, on why it's important at a much broader level. When you look at way things are going, some of the advantages that we have as a company you might be working in, or as a country like India, are that when you compete with others, you compete on 2 or 3 bases. You can compete on the basis of being cheaper, which has long been a thing for the developing world, countries like China, India, Vietnam. They've all specialized in this, that because we can produce things cheaper here than they can in Europe or the US, so we can make things here and export them out to them. So large part of economic growth, in particularly China, has been driven by exports, which have been driven by the fact that they can do things at low cost. The second, which is not just cost, and somewhere we lose out a little bit on, is efficiency. That not only low cost, but can you do it efficiently? Can you do it quickly? Can you do it so that not only is cost minimized, but time is minimized also, so you're able to deliver quickly. So that's the second factor which gives a lot of advantage. As I said, if you look not just at developed countries versus developing countries, where cost is a differentiator, but you look, say, at China and India, and for a variety of reasons which we won't get into, the Chinese tend to be more efficient than us in dealing with things that are physical, material. That's the second one. The third one can be quality. You can yet be as expensive as your competitor, you can yet be only as efficient as your competitor, but if your quality is better, yes, you'll have a market. So you can differentiate on the basis of cost or efficiency or quality. And to give you a concrete example of that, some of you may be a little familiar with it, the Indian IT industry, with which I'm somewhat familiar, worked on this magic mantra of combining these 3. So I used to always tell everybody I was selling to that, look, we can do things not only cheaper, not only better, which is higher quality, not only quicker, but we can do things which are cheaper and better and quicker than anywhere else in the world. And for 2 decades, that has sustained us and yet continues to sustain the Indian IT industry, because it is a fact that in India, we're able to do software cheaper, better and quicker than almost anywhere else in the world. But that is a decreasing disadvantage, because other countries will eventually catch up. Already there are some that are a little cheaper than us. There are some that, with some question marks, may be better than us in terms of quality, maybe limited places like Central Europe or East Europe, not too many, but there are some. And there are some that may be able to do it as quickly as us, like the Chinese, as I mentioned, not only in goods and hardware, but even in software, they are able to put people to it and do it. But the combination is unique to India, but that is going to decrease. So what's the next step? Even there, the next step, as the world knows and Indian companies have recognized, the next step is cheaper, better, quicker and different. Because what is the other competitive advantage that people look at? That how do I differentiate my product? I'm sure you already looked at some of this in your business courses, that when you look at marketing, this is something, if you can't differentiate your product, you create a virtual differentiator. You position yourself in some different way, as by branding or by something else, which is really creating a differentiator of some kind. But the true differentiator is if you're truly different. So if I can do something which seems different, if I can make that product smell different, look different. Example, down to earth, not just theory. You look at Apple. Look at the immense success of things like the iPod first and then the iPhone. They didn't invent any of these. In fact, in every case, there was some company, and typically a large company, that preceded them in introducing the product in the market. So where did they score? They differentiated on product design, on user experience, on having an app store, on having iTunes. So they differentiated themselves in a way that gave them the biggest market share in many spheres where they work in, and certainly the highest market capitalization of all these companies. So differentiator, innovation, important. So what is innovation then? Is it all about creating something different? Is it always about inventing something, which is fantastic? You invent altogether new product, which is the ultimate differentiator. I do a completely new product. It can be a drug, a medicine of some kind. It can be a completely new thing like the Sony Walkman. I think all of you may be too young to have even seen one, but some of my older colleagues will remember the Sony Walkman, which you could put earphones, what all of you do with your cell phones now, and walk around with that. So you can create a completely new product. You can invent one. But I'm particularly now talking to friends who are in business courses, that after the end of the day, some of you may have an interest, you may well go and invent something new, but we are not techies. We're not the guys who go and sit in the lab and create new things. So what do business people do to be inventive and different? They create different business models. And in business models also, you can be as inventive as possible. A couple of examples with which you're all familiar. The famous case of the shampoo sachet. Shampoos sell big time. How do you expand the market? You want to go to rural areas. Rural areas, willingness to pay and affordability is low. They're not going to buy a shampoo bottle. So a couple of companies, weavers would want to take the credit, but others may, came up with this thing of creating a small sachet and selling it at a low price with probably a higher profit margin. So that was not really a new product. It was just a different business model of trying to reach what Professor Prahlad, and I hope some of you have read him by now, called reaching the bottom of the pyramid. Because in countries like India, if you take the distribution curve of income, you have high income and then you have a sort of peak that goes up where you have the middle income or lower middle income, and then you have a long tail of low income people where it drops off. If you can integrate that tail, the market is big. So if you can somehow reach out to all those hundreds of millions of people who are not rich and prosperous, but who have some ability to pay, then that total may well exceed those of the small number of very rich people whom you're selling to. That's one kind of business model. But let me give you another kind of business model to bring a little more interest and sort of wake you up. I don't know how many of you are from or familiar with Bombay. Even those of you are may not have traveled in the Bombay local trains, but I'm sure you're all familiar with the Bombay local trains. Right? If nothing else from Bollywood movies, they show the local trains going up and down. They're very crowded. In my younger days, I've traveled frequently by them, but they're very efficient. So you get from point to point very fast. So those of you who are a little familiar with Bombay, now imagine you're going from Borivali to Churchgate, and you have something important to get to at Churchgate. You're either meeting your partner, your boyfriend, girlfriend, or you're going for a movie, or you're going for a job interview. Very important, you've got to be there on time, you can't be late. So you walk into Borivali station, and then you see a long queue for the tickets. Now Bombay has this thing called a pass, which is really a monthly season ticket. And if you travel frequently, you use that because it's far more economical, obviously, because you're paying a one-time thing, but you can go as many times up and down. But if you're not a regular traveler, it's not worth getting it. So you travel once in a way, you buy a ticket. So you see this long queue, and then you think to yourself, look, I'm a very honest, ethical person, and I must buy a ticket. But then you think, look, I have this critical appointment. Now imagine it's a job interview for a job you really want, So I got to do it. So you say, okay, Bombay locals, crowded. No ticket checker is going to get to you. When you get off at Churchgate, if any of you ever got off there, thousands of people count off each train. There's no way any ticket guy is going to ask you for a ticket. So you say, I hate to do this, but let me take a chance. So you go ticketless and you go there. Now, a fair amount of people do this. Some because of the kind of compulsion I mentioned, not good, but yet a compulsion. Some because they say, hey, why waste money? Let me take a chance. So now here's the business model. This is a clever guy who comes up with this thought, saying, look, your chance of getting caught is low, but if you get caught, the fine is a whopper. You pay a lot of money. So what do you do? So he created a very simple insurance scheme. He says, you pay me a monthly fee, which is far less than the fine. If you get caught, I'll reimburse you. If I don't get caught, I keep it. Now, as you know, this is partly how genuine insurance also works. They gamble on the fact that you won't die young, so the money is with you. And if you do, then we'll see. So without using any great mathematical tools, or one of these guys who are actuarians, as they call the mathematicians who work out stuff which is there, he just, by the innate business sense which most Indians have, worked out that this will work for me. And he made a lot of money, which is a terrible story. Please don't follow that business model. But let me tell you the good part of it. See, all these stories, I always look for the positive silver lining. So what is the silver lining? Now imagine the scenario, not you, me. I'm going ticketless in the train and I get caught. Now, I've got insurance, so I'm okay. But how do I prove to the insurance guy that I paid a fine? He will say, you're putting a fast one. What do you mean you paid a fine? Nonsense. Prove it. So what do I do when the ticket checker comes? The normal one, as most of us know, is that the fine is 500 rupees. He says, 500 rupiah fine, pay up. Otherwise you're in trouble. So then you look at him, he looks at you, then you take out a 100 rupee note and say, chhod do na. So the guy looks at you and says, hey, both come hai, itna se, 500 rupiya fine hai. So you give him another 50 rupees and both of you settle and walk away. Now what happens when you're insured? You can't do that. You need proof. So what do you tell the guy? Okay, I'll pay the fine. Here's 500 rupees. Give me a receipt. And that guy is taken aback. He's not used to giving receipts because he pockets the 250 rupees and goes away. Now he has to give you a receipt. So he gives you a receipt. So what's the good part of it? That guy is honest. See, both people are honest. I'm an honest guy, I paid the fine. He's an honest guy, he gave me a receipt. So some silver lining, but please don't follow this kind of business model. Just one more example for a different type. That's a business model. Let me mention something else, which again doesn't require invention. So again, you don't have to be a great technology whiz kid to do this, or you don't have to go to Institute of Life Sciences to become a great chemical engineer and do something great. This is an example because, Pankaj mentioned I spent many years, in fact I spent many years in Ahmedabad, I should tell you that secret. Much of it was at the Indian Space Research Organization right here in Ahmedabad. So I must tell you a space story which most of you would have heard, but I want you to pick the lesson of that, not the story. In the old days of space flight, 30 years ago, astronauts used to go up, and then there were some scientific experiments. So not all of it could be recorded. For some, they had to take down what you would call from your, remember from your science lab in schools, readings. So they would note down certain figures. So, one of the problems when you're out in space with low gravity is that you can't use what we call an ink pen, which most of you may not be familiar with, but some would know. If you carry an ink pen, even in a plane where the pressure is low, the ink comes out. So in the old days, you would see all these guys, and you could guess, probably you must be a first-time traveler, putting a pen in his pocket, and then at the end of the day, you see a big blotch there when he lands, because he didn't realize the ink is going to come out. A ballpoint pen also, which many of you must be using, and you must have realized this when you try and write this way or even on the wall, it works on gravity flow. So again, unless you have it pointing down, which means gravity, it doesn't write. Now in space, gravity is very low, so you can't use a ballpoint pen either. So what did the Americans do? They had this problem, and in good, true American style, very systematic, very good, they put out what is called an RFP, a request for proposals. So they floated a request for proposals saying, we want something, a ballpoint pen that will write in space with low gravity, low pressure. So they had a lot of proposals, again in proper good style of doing this. They selected not one but two, so one of them will work. They gave a contract. At the end of it, one person did produce something which actually worked. Wonderful device, high technology, and I'm not making fun of them, but this is what the geeks would do, the techie guys would do. And one of the labs did that, produced it. Actually, if you go to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, you can buy that. It's called a space pen. Russians had the same problem. At that time, the Soviets, as they were called, they're competing in space. They had the same problem. They were not as rich as the Americans. They said, what do we do? So they reached their own solution, which is what? Pencil, as most of you would guess. They just used a pencil. Now, unfortunately, this story is great, but it's not fully true. It's only partially true. This is a bit of a made-up story. It's a myth. There was a pencil, again devised incidentally by a US company, which didn't have the problem of, when you write, the lead breaks off a little bit. They didn't want lead floating around to spoil the electronics and so on. But they did use it. But the story is important for the lesson it has. They used a pencil. This is a different kind of innovation, because here there's no business model. There's no new product. It is using an existing product for something else. I must follow this story because it puts the Russians as being innovative. So we Indians are one up on them always, anybody who can innovate. We have our natural abilities. So one more anecdote, which will finally I'll close on the innovation part with that. And this is again, you may not believe it, but this is true. When I left IIM, all of us went into different jobs, and we would get together occasionally over a cup of coffee in Bombay. So a friend from my batch had joined a company which was selling consumer durables. So first few months he was training, then he went here and there. Then he was put to sell washing machines. So on one of our coffee sessions, he was saying, terrible, yeah. He said, washing machines, how can I sell? And they've got such high targets. He said, in Bombay, there's no space. You can't put a washing machine. If you go to Calcutta, there's no power, so you can't run a washing machine. If you go to Chennai, there's no water. Now, most of you are too young to know this. It's a true fact from, 30, 40 years ago. I won't tell you how long ago. No water in Chennai. How are you going to run a washing machine? So how can I sell these washing machines? It's terrible. I've got dumped with this thing. I'm trying hard to get a different product. I've not succeeded. And my targets are high. I'm not meeting my targets. I'm getting very poor performance reviews. A few weeks later, when we had a session, he had gone out of town, came back, and he was very thrilled. He said, I've exceeded my target. My boss is just thrilled. Fantastic. I said, very good, how did you do it? You're telling me all the problems. And this urban India, who else buys washing machines except in urban India, and no market there. He said, I suddenly discovered a lot of orders coming from Punjab. I said, Punjab has no big cities, yeah? Why should people buy washing machines in Punjab? He said, I don't know. But see, he was trained in IIM, like you folks are being trained in BK, very good business school. First thing, do your own research, find out why. So he went back and did a lot of research to say, but why are they buying washing machines in Punjab? I've met my target, I'm happy. My job is over. But I must find out why. So he went back very diligently and did research as to why they're buying washing machines. And of course, again, many of you would know the answer. Washing machines were being bought there to do what? To make lassi. Now, I don't want to be politically incorrect because some of you may be from that part of the country, but it's interesting. You have this typical scene of a group of, young, nice, healthy Punjabi boys going to the local dhaba and saying, oi, 10 glass lassi. And the lassi there is this bigger. And that poor guy is churning on this little mixie, which you see in your kitchen, 1 glass at a time. And these guys are saying, hey, hurry up, yeah, we've got to go. So he figured a very simple way. He bought this washing machine, put everything there, churn it. What 10 glasses? I'll give you 50 glasses straight off. So, a bit of a fun story, and this is true, by the way, really, it did some washing machines there. But again, take the deeper lesson too. Well, you might enjoy it as a joke. Here again is an example of a product. Unlike the pencil in space, which is a product meant to do writing, but used in a different context. Here's a product, which is an existing product. Again, you not invented it, but a product, an existing product, used to do something different. Again, innovation. So think of innovation. Again, as I said, I hope some of you would invent great things because it's the inventions that take civilization forward. But don't get dismayed if you think that innovation is only something that's done in a laboratory and I'm not the engineering laboratory type, what do? You can innovate with business models. You can innovate by taking an existing product and using it in an altogether different context. Or you can take an existing product and create a completely new use for it. Nothing to do with technology, just new use. So look at innovation in these ways. So what is it that you might want to do and how does innovation take place? Now, some of you might want to innovate yourselves, so think of these things. Some of you may look at yourselves, 10 years from now, leading a team and trying to encourage innovation in your company, in your own organization, what you may set up as a startup, whatever. So what are the lessons that you need to do to take innovation, not just yourself, but to infuse it in others? This is something else that I've looked at, not necessarily not as a professional researcher, but just looked at out of interest and curiosity, that what drives innovation? And there are many factors, 2 or 3. One, when I look at the country as a whole, I think we have a unique advantage. Because if there are 3 drivers of innovation that I have to pick, what are the 3 main ones for innovation for a society or a country? I think it's 3 things. One is demographics. Demographics, population, as you know. And what is the thing there? It is a young population. Because young people are the ones who tend to be innovative. And they tend to be innovative because they don't mind making mistakes. They don't mind asking what you might call as foolish questions. Saying, but why not this? Why can't I do that? So that helps innovation. The second is diversity. Very important driver of innovation, diversity. And we have a very diverse population. Now, how is this important? It's important because, typically, when you think of diversity, it's not just diversity in, what kind of, how you look, what clothes you wear, what food you eat. It's also diversity in how you think. And typically in India, in many places, when you grow up, particularly in urban India, at least a few people in your class, in your school, in your college, will be people from a different place, a different location. And so you get used to the fact that they look a little different from you. They speak a different language. At home, they typically eat a different kind of cuisine. And so you get used to the thought that they may think differently from you. You don't question it. There's no group think. So you're used to this concept that people think differently, and that helps. The third factor, which is unfortunate, but which is there, reality today, is adversity, difficulties. When you're faced with adversity, when you come up with a problem, then you've got to find a way around. And you find ways around. And we are very good at it in India, sometimes in a negative way. And I've seen Ahmedabad a little bit, but Delhi is the best example of that. That if you drive on the road in Delhi and there's a traffic jam on one side of the road, what do you do? In most cities, they'll wait, it's a problem, adversity. So what do you do in Delhi? You of course drive on the other side of the road. It's empty, why waste it, drive there. And if you're a two-wheeler, then you get on the pavement, the footpath, and drive there. I think Ahmedabad also saw people do that. I hope none of you do that. So it's again terrible, and I said like this to local train example in Bombay, not an example to emulate, please don't think of it as a good thing at all. But the good part of it is shows that Indians in general are always thinking differently. You're always thinking, how do I beat this problem? Which is what makes us a somewhat indisciplined and chaotic society. But the good part is we always think differently. And so the challenge to you when you become a leader is, how do I take this different thinking, and instead of metaphorically the guy going on the wrong side of the road, how do I channelize that different thinking into something productive? How do I make that creative thinking, the out-of-box idea that comes, the very different idea that comes up, how do I channelize it to do something positive? That's the other part of innovation. So innovation can be any of these. It can be a new invention. It can be using an existing product for something else. It can be using an existing product for what it was meant to be, but in a very different context. Or it can mean channelizing some of these so-called, you're all familiar with the term, I'm sure, the jugaad ideas. Make do, bypass, do something else with it, into a positive sort of direction. And I think these are things which we need to do. Now I want to link these two. Why did I get off into innovation suddenly from having talk of so-called humans need not apply? Because as we look ahead, and I said at least for the next few decades, the one thing that's going to be unique, which human beings do, which machines are not likely to do in the immediate future, and even in the little more distant future, the medium term, unlikely to be able to do as well as human beings, is to innovate, to think completely differently, because machines typically are taught to think in a logical, systematic way, which is good for many, many things, but when you want to do something very new, it doesn't work. And therefore, that is something which you have to keep in mind. And so, to begin to round off what I want to say, there are 3 or 4 things I want to mention to you that, to me, come out from all this and stand out. The first is that in a very changing world, in a world that, some people love to give these acronyms. So some of you may have heard of this. I've called it the VUCA word, V-U-C-A, where there's great deal of vulnerability. Your organization, you yourself are vulnerable to all kinds of external forces, job changes, loss of jobs, new things coming up, disruptive technologies. The second is uncertainty, because you don't know what is going to happen. There's no certainty. You can't predict. You can't project linearly. You can't take what happened in the past and say the same will happen in the future. So uncertainty. The third is complexity. It's become a very complex world. Things are interrelated. One thing creates 10 impacts. Sometimes each of them has 10 different causes. So you don't know what is going to happen. Uncertainty is very high. And the last is really A, which is really looking at things of what is going to happen in the future as being uncertain in a complex world, which is very vulnerable. And so what is it that you can do there? So in that kind of world, what is it that's going to sustain you as you go forward? And what are the lessons that you might take at a personal level from what you might ask, so what do I do? And I think that a couple of things that stand out. One is that given all this uncertainty and change, the one thing that is certain among all the uncertainty is that whatever you have learned and however well you learn, and I'm sure all of you do very, very well academically, whatever you learn here, in about 5-10 years, at least half of it will be obsolete. It's not that it's not going to serve you, it's very, very useful and essential as a foundation. But many of the things you would have learned are, going to be obsolete or not really usable. Some of us grew up using something which you can literally see only in a museum now, something called a slide rule. I'm sure most of you won't know what a slide rule is. You did it for all kinds of calculations and so on, which you did there. And then you had many, many things which were statistical techniques that you learned. They're all on the computer, and you can learn them. It's good to know them, but they're on the computer. So you can do them all there. So given this kind of thing in terms of what you learned here, you need to learn it very well to create the foundation to do other things. The critical thing is learning how to learn. How do you be able to learn new things even when you're out of the academic setting? Here your professors and teachers will continue to teach you what the latest is. Even if it's not in your curriculum, they'll mention it to you and tell you what is happening. When you go out in the job world, how do you make sure that you keep refreshing your learning and your thinking? And that's very critical, that you have to continue to learn. And so you have to begin to learn by yourself. You've got to, as I said, learn how to learn. That's a very important component as you move forward into a world which is uncertain and unsure. You don't know what is coming up. You don't know what the next big thing will be. So you've got to be able to do that, to be able to manage in that kind of world. The second one which I've mentioned and spent some time on is to be innovative. And that means, one, to in some sense train yourself to look beyond what the immediate is, to look at the broader context, to look at broader issues. And the one very concrete way of doing that is to keep in touch with different disciplines. Now, I'm very happy to talk to an audience like this, because in an engineering audience, sometimes I hesitate to see this because, you know, they need to have much more depth. In business, by definition, you need depth, but you also need breadth, which is why you learn a whole range of different subjects. And for that breadth, you've got to broaden it beyond the business subjects you have. And again, let me give you one example. I mentioned drones, and I mentioned drones in the context of large unmanned vehicles. But there are also these small drones, which are more popular and which many of you have read about probably. Some which may one day deliver your pizza, as they say, to your rooftop. But there are even much smaller drones that are used for a whole variety of things where people can't go, or where they want to go and sort of snoop on somebody. And some of them are literally this big or smaller, and they fly. Now, when they were designing these drones, one big challenge was, how do they negotiate unknown objects that come in the way? You know, if you're mapped out where it's going, you can see what is coming, that's fine. But if something comes up suddenly, like when you're driving, imagine when you drive, you're seeing the traffic is there, and suddenly somebody shoots out of a small side road. Now, most of us have our natural instinct and reactions to be able to take that and quickly either avoid it, or stop, or brake, or do something else. How do drones learn that? How do you teach them to do that? And so what the researchers found, the best example of this was in fact from biological sciences. How does a bee, you know, what you might call a honeybee or a bumblebee, how do they do this? They're flying from somewhere to somewhere, from their, you know, honeycomb to the nearest flower somewhere, and suddenly something comes in between. A human being suddenly steps up. They're able to avoid any object that's there. So they found out from the biological sciences how that's done, and then translated it to the electromechanical world of drones. So this is taking learning from one field and applying it to another. A very important part of what you need to do today, and certainly in the future world, is to be able to take from one discipline, abstract that, and see how you might apply it somewhere else. And you can think of many examples of this. I can go on to dwell on it. I can give you many examples where this happens. You pick something from one discipline and apply it somewhere else. And it's been done continuously in the world to really get breakthrough things, where something very new, not an incremental thing, not a 10% more efficiency or a 5% more efficiency, but something radically new. And therefore, when you go out into the world, and even today when you're studying, keep in mind the importance to have this breadth, to keep in touch with other areas, other subjects, other people, which gives you both the diversity, which I mentioned earlier, and this ability to pick from one subject and say, hey, will this apply here? Can I use something here? Can something be done here with this knowledge that I have from there? So this cross-fertilization between disciplines is very important when you want to think of creativity, innovation, solutions for problems that you face. And there are many, many examples of how it works. So in the ideal world, you should try and look at yourself as a T-function human being. A T-function human being is like the letter T, the capital T. As you know, T has a long thing with this, which you might look at as breadth. So you need a whole range of abilities in terms of the breadth of understanding, and not just from quantitative areas to marketing and finance, but also maybe a little bit of biology and physics and sciences to the pure humanities, maybe even poetry and music, that range. But you also need depth, which is the other arm of the T, because you need to have depth in some area. You need to have a deeper understanding. You need to be, if not a specialist, at least have enough understanding in a certain field or a certain area to be able to carry your own with experts in that area. And I think that should be the kind of goal you head to. And if you look at that, then the fact that you might see an ad saying humans need not apply, need not worry you, because there'll be lots of other things that will say only humans and intelligent, innovative humans need to apply. So I think that's the lesson you might want to read. Let me stop there, and I'm very happy to take questions, comments, whatever you want for maybe the next half an hour or so, or 20, 25 minutes. Thank you.
So thank you so much. It was enlightening indeed. It is now time literally for what we call In Conversation with Leaders. So the floor is open for questions. If anybody has any question for Sir. Yeah, we have.
Thank you for delivering such a wonderful talk, sir. I would like to ask a question about the very same topic that you said, humans need not apply. On one side, if we see technological advancement is creating less of job opportunities for technically what we call as unskilled labor. As you said, gave the example of drivers. But on the other hand, if you look at the positive side, it also encourages education because it gives encouragement to skilled labor. So it in a way or the other is pushing everyone, and especially which is important for our economy, that is education, which even we have governmental schemes of providing education. So in a way it also has a positive side that it is encouraging education. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, absolutely right. I completely agree with you. This is the critical part of what we need to look at. Very often, I'm sure also it's heard the expression demographic dividend. Demographic dividend for India is the fact that we have a very large percentage of our people who are young, and that has benefits. I mentioned innovation in passing, but the economic benefits, because what an economist, I suppose some of you have done a little bit of that, called the dependency ratio between those who are in the working age group and those who are either too young or too old to work is favorable. So the demographic dividend can turn to a demographic disaster, if you like, if we don't make sure that these young people are skilled and educated. So that's a big challenge for the country. And how do you take all these people? And the estimate has been that we need to skill and educate 500 million people in the next 6 or 7 years. It's going to be a real challenge for us to do that. As you rightly said, the government is seized of this problem, but we've got to really do all we can. It's truly a big challenge. Just in passing, I might add that we want to create a scare scenario as all jobs are going to disappear. But yes, the trend, you put your finger on it, is that the jobs which are unskilled often tend to go away first, and we've seen that happening. So we've got to make sure that people begin to develop the skills that are necessary to get them not only jobs, but higher value jobs. So we do something which gives you higher value.
Hello, sir. Thank you for the fruitful insights. So, with internet, the world is becoming small and connected. Google is planning to provide internet to various villages of India through drones, as you rightly mentioned. And also, Japan is testing right now the 5G internet. But India as a nation is still dealing with the problem of net neutrality. Although FCC had given certain rules about net neutrality in the country. Sir, what are your views on the same, and what do you think the government should do about the problem of net neutrality?
I don't know how many of you are familiar with what you obviously know is the issue of net neutrality. Probably you all know about it. The simple answer is yes, I very much feel net neutrality. And in very simple terms, not in all the pros and cons. The issue is slightly more complex than the issue of black and white. But I think one of the major factors is that if you don't have net neutrality, then new players who want to come on would face difficulties. And all technologies, but particularly as we've seen, internet technologies, are ones which thrive by having new ideas, new players coming continuously on. Facebook itself, which in a sense was seeming to violate the net neutrality principle through its free basics, itself is, as you know, a recent startup. And they may never have come up if had net neutrality not existed when they came up, when people could access them easily. And therefore, the thought is that while, as I said, I don't pretend that it's all black and white, because they have some things in favor of what they are saying. But while in the short run it may benefit some people by providing free access to limited, but some internet, in the slightly longer run, even the medium term, it will be very counterproductive because no new things would have access. And so the new ideas, new sites, altogether new technologies that come up will be in some sense stifled. So I am very much for net neutrality, but you obviously know a lot about it. And for those of you who don't know what that is about, please talk to him and he'll give you a tutorial on it.
Sir, you talked about artificial intelligence in the beginning of your speech. So the question I have, and that has been there with me, is consciousness programmable, or is it too organic for machines to understand the concept of sentience? So that's a simple question that I have.
Question is simple, the answer is next to impossible. So it's a deep metaphysical question, frankly. And I don't know how many of you have seen, or read Arthur Clarke's books, and particularly if you've seen 2000, where the machine begins to think and even have emotions. Now, consciousness is beyond thinking, it's beyond emotions. So one is, hard pressed to say what it is. And on the more neurological, scientific side too, many of neurosurgeons have tried to identify where it is that this so-called consciousness may lie within our brains. And I think there are yet some open questions there. As far as I know, I'm not an expert in this area at all. But I think it's a much deeper question. And the way things are progressing, many people would say that you don't know when, maybe 30 years, maybe 50 years from now, there will be some form of machine that will at least simulate that to some extent. But I think things like consciousness and wisdom, to me, are quite some way off. These are somewhat unique human traits, and I don't really know whether you can ever really get them into a machine or not. But who knows, one of you may be the guy who invents it or does something to put it together. I really don't know where it is, because you're seeing such revolutionary changes in technology that it's become difficult to predict what might happen next. But to me, certainly this one of the more intangible, abstract parts of what a human being is and what drives human thinking and human reactions is a tough one, right? It's like the one about ethics, that while machine may do all kinds of things, can you really teach a machine ethics? Maybe you can by endless examples and artificial intelligence self-learning, but it's going to be a tough one, and consciousness is way more complex than that.
Since the previous question at the back, since the previous question was about some metaphysical entity, I would also like to ask, when the sphere of intellectuality is much more captured by non-human element, it's kind of a supplementary question to it. What would then become of the self? And my second question to it is that in India to innovation, there are challenges, especially in the issues of IPR, intellectual property rights. So what would be your view to it, and how the government should try and somehow enable the mechanism of protecting those intellectual property rights for innovation to take place in society?
Well, your first question, you said, is a takeoff from the earlier question, which is truly in the realm of metaphysical, and I'm not a philosopher, so I can only be as doubtful or as speculative as the next person. Who knows what is that I? And sometimes, even in just simplistic terms, one wonders what is I. If all your parts in your body are getting replaced by machines, today you can already have artificial hands, artificial legs, artificial lung and heart machines. So brain replacement or brain transplant is being talked of. So what is the I that remains is a question that I would leave for something which you have debate over a cup of coffee or many cups of coffee, because it can go on and on, that what is the remaining I. Suppose, just imagine a large part of your body parts were replaced, and not by transplants but by machines. Then what is the I in you? What remains of you? It's very difficult. It's far too metaphysical. So I don't think there's an answer, but you can speculate, you can discuss. It's a very good point to think about, but I don't know beyond that. And a sort of corollary to your question may be that if machines begin to get all that intelligent, then instead of us programming machines, the machines begin to program us. There are lots of science fiction stuff on that, even some movies, so that's something is in the realm of our imagination, but hopefully it won't happen anytime soon. Your second, much more concrete question, I think really where things are going in that area depends on what you want to look at from the perspective of technology and where it might take us. And again, answers would be somewhat speculative in terms of what it is. But again, I would say, it's easy to take one side or the other, but these issues are not really black and white. It's more complex than that. And this one is in some ways as complex or more than the net neutrality question. So one can have a personal viewpoint on it, but it's difficult to say that this is right and that is not. There are no logical, definite answers. There are no unique answers to it. So you have to really see where you stand and what context you're looking at, because it's also contextual, many of these. So it really depends on where you are and what sort of either personal stance or ideological stance that you want to take in the context that you're in. As context changes, some of these may change, so one has to really look at where it is.
Due to time constraints, we will now have one last question.
Sir, had two questions. One was, what is your view on the backdoor issue that Tim Cook has versus the FBI? Second question, when you say that the future is uncertain, what is it that becomes of the curriculum? What should students learn and what should universities teach?
Let me start with the second one. I think it's a very good question, and there are lots of pedagogic experts here who know order of magnitude more than I, and they can answer it. But my quick answer from the point of view as a practitioner and somebody uses is that two things are critical. One is that the foundations, even those change with times. I mean, what I learned in physics today, some of it is disproved, and so one questions that too. But otherwise, the foundations remain the same. The second is that one of the things that education does is it trains you to think. And I think that's a very, very important part of what education does. The third, which is implicitly part of the curriculum, is that it gives you a window to what knowledge exists and what you don't know. It's not just what you learn in the books, you begin to know that, hey, I don't know. As somebody put it very, very, very metaphorically, that the bigger the island of knowledge, the more the shoreline of the unknown. As the island goes, the unknown goes. And you begin to realize that. As I say about India, I get all these foreign friends who come in and always tell them this thing. And I said, in day one, you're amazed by India. On day 3, you think you are an India expert. Only on day 10, you realize I know nothing about India. People like me who have stayed here all my life, but I even know less about India, because whatever you say, the opposite is equally true. So it's something like that in terms of knowledge. But other part of your question, I emphasized only on that part, but I think that's a very critical part, which is why, to me, that's why I emphasized it, that with changing times, one of the important parts of the curriculum is that while you go through what is in the curriculum, train them to think, give them the basic knowledge, give them some of the information which you can pick up from wherever else, and go ahead. It also is, in some sense, teaching them how to think, how to learn. And that learning, the ability of how to learn, and how to learn, more importantly, your modern curriculum teaches you how to learn, not just from one source. It's not just what the teacher says, which is ancient Gurukul. It's not just what the teacher plus textbook says, which is much of the conventional thing. Today it is teacher plus textbook plus, say, the internet, which is more contemporary and new things are there. And tomorrow it may be something else. So putting all these tools together, your curriculum must be therefore focused, as it does today, on telling people that look, there are multiple sources of information, knowledge, and of learning, and tap them all. Some are given to you formally in the classroom, some happen informally as you chat with your peers over a cup of tea or walking down the corridor and so on, and some come from the outside world, and some are experiential. Very important. Experiential learning is a very, very good and a deeper way of learning. Experience something, don't just ignore it. I mean, what have I learned from it? I think that's really the critical part here. Sorry, your first question was on... No, I think it's very important here. See, to me, the outstanding thing, and again, you can argue for privacy versus security. You can argue for maybe Apple being concerned a little bit about its own interests also, because they thrive a great deal on assuring privacy to all their customers, both individuals and corporate customers. But also, I think it's a matter of principle. And to me, it's a very tough call. Personally, and it's a purely personal opinion. Obviously, all my opinions are personal, but I'm very opinionated. And I feel that in many parts of the world, we've overdone the security. We all know that we are in a threatened world. We all know that there are terrorists floating around. We all know that we are under attack. But what is your reaction to that's important? And not just your reaction to me, and I'm sorry, I must take 2 minutes on this because you provoked me on this question. It's important that we recognize what it is that you're protecting. You want to protect yourself, your community, your family, your country against terrorists. But what is it that you're protecting? You're protecting a certain way of life. If tomorrow we are told the safest thing is for us to go live in jail, let the terrorists float around there, and we are all very safe there, would we accept that? I doubt it. Most of us would not. I think all of us would not. And that's an extreme way of putting it. And sometimes I worry that in our concerns about security, we are sacrificing what the security is for and what it's against. And therefore, the long answer and a quick final sentence on this, what particularly strikes me and I say this somewhat provocatively in the context of what often happens in our country, is that while Tim Cook can be faulted, can be argued against, and maybe he's wrong, and I see very much on the FBI side to say that he's wrong, we should give this to them. But the fact is that while the argument goes on, the legal things will go on, there's a lot of pros and cons, a lot of debate in the US. I haven't heard an article, and not even Donald Trump has called him anti-national. And I think there's an important lesson there for not just us, countries around the world, that these are arguments, they're tough arguments. And while I said, I see completely the FBI's logic in saying, hey, here's something and this guy has actually shot people. So give us access to his phone, what's your problem? And I see the strong argument. And you know, Tim Cook, as I said, is not just all altruistic, there's some motives behind it too, possibly, I don't know, but I'm assuming there's some. But the debate is on, and the debate is a healthy, strong one. We don't know where it will go, but it's a debate. It's not labeling people, it's the issue. The issue is privacy versus security. The issue is not whether Tim Cook is national or anti-national. Fortunately, he is American. Had he been an immigrant, the issue may have got more complex. And had he been an immigrant with a different name, it may have got even more complex. But that's the way it is, and I respect the kind of society that allows debate like this in a very open way and with strong arguments on both sides. It's a long answer. Thank you.
Very much so.
I think we could still have one more question. So.
All right. I'm struggling to frame this. The more you have spoken, the more the question is circling around in my mind.
I think you have spoken too much.
Or I am not capable of thinking clear. It starts with this something that I was reading about 8-10 months ago in some magazine somewhere, where it was where they were talking about the fact that to encourage innovation among the engineering students in China, the curriculum was encouraging reading of science fiction. And it connects with what you were talking about, the fact that understanding of diversity, understanding of various thoughts, understanding of different ideas comes in, which is extremely important to be able to come up with newer ways of doing things. And it connects with our people, our ethos of India as people. We are extremely resistant to change. Of late, you raised the topic of the anti-nationalism bit that is happening anyways. We are very resistant to change. How much of those things, and also the curriculum that Somil sir was talking about, how many of those things are connected in stopping us from actually coming up with the so-called disruptive innovation that is driving most of the modern world economy right now?
You know, I clearly understand what you're saying, and there is a strong argument logically to support what you're saying. But my view is, in some ways, I wouldn't say the other extreme, I'm just exaggerating, but I think that we are by nature very innovative. It's partly our system, partly the school education system, where, as I often say, in most of our school system, not tarnishing all of it the same way, but in much of our conventional system, you're taught from school, from class 1, that keep your ears open, keep your mouth tightly shut, don't speak. Whereas anything which you speak anywhere else for education, for learning, for understanding, for innovation, requires you to speak, to discuss, to talk. Second thing we are taught is no copying, which makes sense, but it means work by yourself. Whereas around the world and in education, just as innovation, just as any corporate work, it requires you to work in a team. So from day one, you are taught, don't ask questions and work by yourself. And to me, true education is not just about answering questions. It is, you get a question paper and you're supposed to write answers, and that's important. But true education, not just testing your information skills or maybe some of your knowledge, true education is when you begin to question the answers. If somebody tells you this is so, you should feel free to say, but why? And why can't it be something else? And that's how disruption and creativity comes up. And to me, it seems we Indians are in fact geared for that. I always make this sort of comment, and I particularly tell, and I can say now that, for many years I used this with great success in the US. They would always ask me in those years, now maybe we are, as somebody said today, we are shining, we are way ahead of China in terms of growth, not in terms of size. But they used to ask me about China and India, and I used to tell them all the negatives of China. But at the end of the day, I used to tell them one thing. I said, look, if you go to China and you look at a production line, and this is really using what they know and what they use against us positively, you see how efficiently they're working. Every worker is doing his bit or her bit in getting it done. You go to India, and the first thing the guy does You say, why am I doing it this way, why not that way? Then the guy wants a break, then he wants to have tea, then you talk with somebody else. And I said, this is terrible. So you want to mass produce, please go to China. But if you want somebody who's asking you questions and saying, why this, can't I do it that way, and thinking of new ways of doing something, please come to India. You make up your mind. And I knew what they were looking for, they were listening. So, I think your question, long-winded answer again, but I think we are naturally innovative and creative. And I gave the example of the roads. I can give 20 other examples where we all the time, most of us look at it as I do, as being terrible because of breaking rules. But I don't think so much breaking the rule as finding a way out. Somehow finding a way out. You go to a government office and he says, I'm closed now, I've done this, I've done that. So, about half the people, in my estimation, will pay the guy and get it done. Terrible way, but you find a way out. So that's a wrong way to do it. But you find a way out. Now that's not common. I said, you go to Singapore and I have great praise for them. You see the road and you see a line of cars 2 kilometers long, just stationary. If a cow comes in front of a car, you just stop. In India, you will go to the wrong lane, you go to the other side, you do something. All bad. I'm not praising it at all. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm saying that innately wanting to find a way around. We are not innately disciplined and thinking in a straight line. And to me, that is something which we have to see as a country, as a society, and indeed, as I said earlier, if you're in a company or an organization, not just a company, you have to see how do I tap into this immense ability to think differently and find the solution. How do I tap into it in a positive way to channelize it for something that is positive and good? So I would argue very strongly that we are innovative. In fact, it's our biggest plus as you move into a new world where efficiency is important but is not critical. Just as in today's world, cost is very important but not the most critical factor. People are willing to pay a little more for a better quality product, for good service, for something that looks nice. Why do you buy an Apple phone? It costs more than anything else. And yet they sell very much, to give you that same example. There are things which you value, maybe brand value, maybe the design, maybe it looks better, maybe your friend values, something else. In the same way, I think the world of tomorrow, when you look at that, I think India stands to be a big winner. But we've got to tap into this. We've got to make sure that we don't kill that innovative ability from a young age, just as we kill the excellent people we have. Nobody's here from that, or administrative services. Practice people go there, even today, and certainly in the past. But the system just puts them into a box, and then you say bureaucracy, how terrible. Actually, they're bright people, but the system has killed them. So we have to look at our systems, and I think that's true in an organization. The lesson to me of this long thing is that organizations have to look, are your systems nimble and supple to allow this creativity, this innovation to take place and actually encourage it. But I would say yes, we are very innovative.
So thank you so much. May I now invite Professor Amrita Bihani to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the entire BKMIBA family, I, Amrita Bihani, would like to take this opportunity to thank all our esteemed speakers who graced this podium with their valuable presence this afternoon. I would like to first thank Dr. Pankaj Chandra, Chairman, Board of Management, Ahmedabad University, for addressing the audience and setting an encouraging tone for the 4th annual lecture of BKMIBA. We are also thankful to Mr. B.M. Shah, Registrar, Ahmedabad University, Professor Devnath Tirupati, Dean AMSOM, Head Sister Institutions, and all other invited guests who have joined us today on this occasion. It was indeed a pleasure to listen to our guest speaker, Mr. Kiran Karnik. Sir, your emphasis on change being the only constant in today's time, and how students, in fact all of us, need to foresee, innovate, adapt, adjust, evolve to the ever-changing world, environment, or maybe VUCA world is more apt. Curiosity, innovation, and continuous learning being the key to grow and achieve success. These lessons have been inspiring for both us as well as our students, and I'm sure our students have gained immensely from your thought-provoking discourse. A heartfelt gratitude to the BKMIBA faculty, staff, and the CREATE members who made it possible to organize this event. My vote of thanks would be incomplete without thanking our students, student audience who have turned up in large numbers and graced this occasion. Thank you once again.
Before we end the function, let's rise for the spirit of India. I request everybody to please rise up for the anthem. for being such a wonderful audience. And I also request all of you all to join us for refreshments outside. Have a great day. Thank you.